Imagine this. Your baby is crying, you're broke, and in a moment of desperation, you accidentally text your ex, the billionaire you ran from a year ago. But instead of ignoring you, he shows up at midnight, outside your window, in a fleet of black SUVs, and suddenly, your world is no longer yours. Will this be a rescue or the start of a nightmare? I'm Selena from Heartwoven Tales. Hope you're doing well. Tell me, where are you listening from today? Make sure you watch till the end because this story is intense, shocking, and absolutely unmissable. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now let's dive in. Milano stood in the narrow kitchen of her fourth-floor apartment with the lights turned off. Not because she liked the darkness, but because the electricity bill notice taped near the sink had started to feel like an accusation every time she looked at it. And in that moment, she didn't have the strength to face another reminder of what she couldn't fix. The cold tile seeped through the thin soles of her socks as she held the empty formula tin in her hands, tilting it slowly, then shaking it once, with a small, pointless hope that maybe a scoop had been hiding somewhere it shouldn't have been. But the sound that came out was hollow and final, plastic scraping plastic, a sound she had learned to dread. From the living room, her daughter's cry drifted in again, not loud, not demanding, but strained and tired, the kind of cry that came from a baby who had already learned that energy was something to ration. Milano closed her eyes for a second and pressed the container to her chest, as if warmth could come from it, her stomach twisting painfully as her own hunger answered Leah's cries, reminding her that she hadn't eaten properly in days and that the half cup of tea she'd forced down earlier had done nothing except keep her upright. 1 year, she thought, the number rising in her mind without effort, exactly 1 year since she had walked out of Brian's life without turning back. 1 year since she had chosen fear over comfort, uncertainty over luxury, silence over suffocation. And as much as she tried not to think about him, the number made it impossible not to remember the way his voice used to sound when he said her name. Slow and possessive, like saying it out loud meant he owned it. She moved into the living room, her steps careful, not because the floor was fragile, but because she'd trained herself to move quietly. A habit she never fully shook after leaving him, and lifted Leah from the crib, pulling the thin blanket tighter around her small body as the baby rooted weakly against her shoulder, searching for something Milano didn't have. "I know," she murmured, her voice low and steady even though her chest felt tight, even though panic hovered just beneath her ribs, waiting for permission to take over. She bounced gently, rocking side to side, whispering nonsense words the way mothers did when words failed, her eyes drifting around the apartment as if the walls themselves might offer a solution. The place was small, cramped, patched together with secondhand furniture and borrowed time, but it was quiet, and no one here watched her phone, no one asked where she was going, no one decided what was best for her before she had a chance to speak. Brian had called that kind of control love, had wrapped his rules in concern and his surveillance in affection, and she had believed him for far too long, right up until the day she'd stared at 2 lines on a test and realized that if she stayed, neither she nor the child inside her would ever breathe freely again. "We're okay," she whispered to Leah, even though the words felt fragile, even though she wasn't sure who she was trying to convince. "We're still okay." Her phone lay face down on the small table, silent and heavy with possibility, and Milano stared at it longer than she wanted to admit before finally reaching for it, her fingers stiff from cold and fatigue as she unlocked the cracked screen. She opened her wallet again, counting the money even though she already knew the number, 2 wrinkled bills and a handful of coins that clinked softly in her palm. $2.14 that wouldn't buy formula, wouldn't buy diapers, wouldn't buy time, and a short, bitter laugh escaped her before she could stop it, because the absurdity of it all suddenly felt overwhelming. She had left a millionaire to protect her child, and here she was, calculating coins like a crime. Leah whimpered again, the sound cutting through her thoughts, and Milano's pride folded in on itself without much of a fight. She scrolled through her contacts, the list shorter than it used to be, names missing that had faded away when the money disappeared and the excuses became repetitive, and without letting herself overthink it, she tapped her brother's name, her thumbs hovering for just a second before exhaustion won. The message came out fast and raw, typed with shaking fingers and no corrections, a quiet confession, sent into the dark asking for $40 and mercy, ending with a plea that no one else be told, because even now, even like this, Milano couldn't bring herself to explain everything out loud. She hit send and slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her back against peeling paint, Leah cradled against her chest as she focused on breathing through the tightness in her throat. The message said delivered almost immediately, but she didn't look at it for long because waiting was easier than hoping, and hope had a way of hurting when it didn't show up. The apartment was still, the city noise muted through thin glass, and for a few seconds it felt like time had slowed, like the world was holding its breath with her. Then her phone vibrated, sharp and sudden against her leg, and Milano froze, her body reacting before her mind could catch up, because the speed of it was wrong, too fast, and a cold awareness slid through her chest. She lifted the phone slowly, her thumb hovering as if touching the screen might make whatever was waiting there more real, and her eyes went first to the contact name, not the message itself, because some instincts never fade. The name staring back at her wasn't her brother's. It was Brian. The same name she had trained herself not to say, not to search, not to think about. The same name attached to a profile picture she hadn't deleted because some part of her had always believed she shouldn't pretend he'd never existed. Her breath caught, a sharp, painful inhale that made her dizzy, and she whispered no under her breath as if refusal alone could undo what she was seeing. She scrolled up frantically, checking the thread, the sent message, her exact words sitting there like evidence, and confusion tangled with fear as her mind scrambled for explanations that didn't involve him. Sleep deprivation, muscle memory, a mistake, anything but this. Before she could process it, another vibration rattled through the phone, and she read the reply without meaning to, the words hitting harder than any accusation. He said he'd been waiting for the text for a year, and the room seemed to shrink around her as old memories surged forward, uninvited. The way he used to anticipate her needs before she spoke, the way he always knew. Her phone buzzed again, the next message shorter, colder, a command wrapped in calm certainty telling her to look out the window, and Milano's heart began to pound so loudly she was sure Leah could hear it. She didn't move right away. Didn't want to confirm the fear crawling up her spine, and instead whispered to herself that he couldn't be here, that this was a trick, that the fourth floor and locked doors still meant something. But as she stood slowly and took a step toward the curtain, holding her daughter tighter as if instinctively shielding her, a terrible realization settled in her gut, heavy and undeniable, because this didn't feel like coincidence or chance or fate. It felt deliberate, and before she even pulled the curtain aside, Milano understood the truth she'd spent a year trying to outrun. The mistake wasn't sending the message. The mistake was believing she had ever truly disappeared. Milano stood frozen in front of the window for a long moment after that realization settled into her bones, her hand still gripping the thin curtain while the city lights bled through the grime on the glass. And for a few seconds she hoped she had imagined it, hoped her fear had finally crossed into hallucination. But when she forced herself to focus, when she leaned closer and wiped a small, clear patch with the sleeve of her sweater, the truth came into sharp, unforgiving focus. 3 black SUVs sat below her building, engines running, perfectly aligned as if the broken street had been designed just for them. Their headlights cutting through the fog and darkness with an intentional steadiness that made her chest tighten, because nothing about them belonged there. Not in this forgotten block where streetlights flickered and trash bags collected in corners. Leah shifted in her arms, letting out a thin cry that sounded louder in the sudden silence of Milano's mind. And instinctively, Milano stepped back from the window, pulling the curtain shut as if fabric could erase what she had seen. "No," she whispered again, shaking her head slowly, the word leaving her mouth like a prayer she didn't believe would be answered. Because the building had 4 floors, because the stairwell door downstairs barely locked, because anyone with enough money could turn distance into a suggestion instead of a barrier, and Brian had never believed in limits when it came to her. Her phone buzzed again in her hand, and this time she didn't look at it, because she already knew what it would say, knew that whatever message waited there would be calm and confident and terrifyingly sure of itself, and instead she moved, her body finally remembering how to function under pressure. She crossed the room quickly, setting Leah back into the crib as gently as she could, whispering soft, useless reassurances, while her eyes darted to the door, the window, the corners of the room as if exits might appear if she looked hard enough. "Stay quiet, baby," she murmured, brushing her fingers over Leah's cheek, even though the hunger cry wouldn't be reasoned with, even though fear didn't care about logic. Milano straightened and moved toward the door, checking the lock with shaking hands, sliding the chain into place even as a bitter thought cut through her mind that chains only worked when the person on the other side respected them. The hallway outside was silent for a moment, almost mockingly so, and she found herself holding her breath, counting the seconds, wondering if he would knock, if he would pretend to be civilized, if a year had softened anything at all. Then she heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, unhurried, the sound of expensive shoes against cracked concrete, climbing the stairs one by one, each step landing with confidence, with ownership, as if he'd walked these stairs 1,000 times already. Milano's pulse raced, her thoughts scattering as she backed away from the door, her eyes flicking to the small kitchen knife on the counter, to the phone still buzzing silently in her hand, to the crib where Leah's cries had turned sharper, more desperate. "Please," Milano whispered under her breath, not sure who she was begging anymore, because the footsteps didn't stop, didn't hesitate, didn't speed up either. And when they reached her floor, the pause that followed was worse than the noise, a quiet stretch of time that felt calculated, like he was giving her just enough space to imagine escape before taking it away. The knock never came. Instead, there was a sudden, violent crash as the door burst inward, the chain snapping uselessly, the frame splintering under the force, and Milano screamed despite herself as the apartment filled with cold night air and the presence she had tried so hard to erase from her life. Brian stepped inside like he belonged there, like he owned the space and everything in it, his tall frame filling the doorway, his tailored suit pristine and dark against the peeling walls, shoes polished to a shine that felt obscene in a room where the carpet was worn thin. His eyes swept the apartment in a single glance, taking in the small furniture, the bare counters, the cheap crib, and something unreadable flickered across his face before his gaze locked onto the source of the sound he'd clearly been waiting for. The baby's cry cut through the room, sharp and insistent, and Brian's expression shifted, his jaw tightening as he walked forward without asking, without acknowledging Milano's presence at all, his attention fixed on the crib as if nothing else mattered. "Don't," Milano said, her voice hoarse, stepping into his path even though her legs felt weak, her hands raised instinctively as if she could physically stop him. "Don't touch her." Brian didn't even slow down. He moved around her with minimal effort, his shoulder brushing past her like she was furniture, and leaned over the crib, looking down at Leah with an intensity that made Milano's stomach twist. The baby cried louder now, her small body arching, fists clenched, and for a split second, Brian simply watched her, his face carefully neutral, the same expression he used to wear in meetings when he was deciding whether to buy or destroy. Then he reached down and lifted Leah from the crib with practiced ease, cradling her against his chest as if he'd done it before. as if this moment had been rehearsed in his mind long before it ever happened. Milano lunged forward, panic exploding through her as she grabbed at his arm, her fingers digging into expensive fabric. "Give her back," she said, her voice shaking but loud, the words spilling out without thought. "She's scared. You're hurting her. Just give her back." Brian finally looked at her then, really looked at her, his eyes cold and assessing, and for a moment there was something almost satisfied in his gaze, as if seeing her like this confirmed something he'd always believed. Leah's cries softened slightly against his chest, confused by the sudden change, and Brian adjusted his hold, supporting her head with a familiarity that made Milano's heart drop. He studied the baby's face closely, tracing her features with his eyes, lingering on her chin, her mouth, the curve of her jaw, and when he looked back up at Milano, the smile that spread across his lips was slow and unsettling. "She has my jawline, Milano," he said calmly, his voice low and controlled, as if he were stating a fact in a boardroom rather than holding a crying child in a broken apartment. "Did you really think you could hide a billionaire's heir in a trash can like this?" The words hit her like a slap, and for a second Milano couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything except stare at him as the full weight of his assumption settled in. He believed it. He truly believed the story he had built in his head, the timeline he had convinced himself of, and as Leah whimpered softly between them, Milano realized with a sickening clarity that this wasn't just about money or control anymore. This was about possession. And standing there, watching Brian hold her daughter with that look on his face, she understood that whatever happened next, this night had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The moment stretched after Brian's words, heavy and suffocating, and Milano realized that arguing with him in that apartment was pointless because the decision had already been made somewhere far above her, calculated and approved long before he ever climbed those stairs. And within minutes, the space filled with men who didn't introduce themselves, didn't explain, and didn't ask permission, moving with quiet efficiency as if they were executing a routine task rather than dismantling what little life she had built. Milano barely remembered walking down the stairs, barely remembered the cold air biting her face as she was guided toward one of the SUVs, her hands trembling as she clutched Leah tightly against her chest, the baby now quiet but alert, her dark eyes flicking between unfamiliar faces. Brian walked beside them without touching her, close enough that Milano could feel his presence, his calm a sharp contrast to the chaos inside her head. And when the car doors closed and the engine pulled them away from the crumbling building, she stared out the window at the disappearing streetlights, a strange numbness creeping in as the city gave way to long, empty roads. No one spoke. No one explained where they were going. She tried to focus on the details, on memorizing turns and landmarks, but the darkness swallowed everything, and time blurred until the car finally slowed, the sound of waves faint but unmistakable, and the gates ahead slid open without a sound. The mansion rose from the cliffs like something unreal, all glass and steel and light, its clean lines cutting sharply against the night sky. And as Milano stepped inside, the warmth and brightness hit her like a shock. The floors polished, the air scented faintly of something expensive and unfamiliar, making her feel instantly out of place, like she had been dropped into someone else's life without warning. Everything happened quickly after that, too quickly to process, as if speed itself was part of the strategy. Someone took Leah gently from her arms for a moment to check her vitals, while another person handed Milano a folded blanket softer than anything she'd ever owned. And before she could protest, a doctor appeared, calm and professional, examining Leah with tools that looked far too advanced for a private residence. "She's underfed but stable," the doctor said evenly, not looking at Milano as he spoke. And those words cut deeper than any accusation because they were true. Formula arrived in minutes, a brand Milano had only ever seen behind locked pharmacy cases, and when Leah drank, the desperate way she latched on made Milano turn her head, shame and relief tangling painfully in her chest. Brian hovered in the background, watching everything with quiet satisfaction, occasionally giving instructions, occasionally checking his phone, completely at ease in a world that bent instantly to his will. When it was over, when Leah finally slept in a crib that looked more like a piece of art than furniture, Milano stood there feeling hollow, surrounded by luxury that felt invasive rather than comforting, and when she reached for her phone to call her mother to say she was safe or at least alive, the screen mocked her with a single bar that vanished the moment she tried to dial. No signal, no service. She tried the Wi-Fi next, fingers moving faster now, only to find it locked behind permissions she didn't have. Access denied flashing back at her again and again, and a cold understanding settled in her gut as she realized this wasn't an oversight. This was design. She found Brian in his study not long after, standing in the doorway for a second, just watching him sit behind a wide desk of dark wood, the walls lined with screens displaying markets and news she didn't care about, the glow reflecting off his composed face as he scrolled through his tablet. "We appreciate the help," she said, keeping her voice steady with effort, stepping fully into the room because she refused to speak from a distance, like a child asking permission. "But we're leaving tomorrow." The words sounded reasonable, even polite, and she clung to that because if she let herself sound afraid, she knew he would hear it and enjoy it. Brian didn't look up right away. He finished whatever he was reading, set the tablet down carefully, and only then lifted his eyes to her, and the calm in his expression told her everything she didn't want to hear. "The gates are biometric." "Milano," he said evenly, as if explaining a simple fact she should have already known. "They only open for me." He stood then, slow and deliberate, walking around the desk toward her, stopping just close enough to make his presence unavoidable. "You wanted $40, he continued, his voice low, almost conversational. "I've given you a life of millions." He paused, watching her face as the meaning sank in, and when he spoke again, there was no anger, no raised voice, only certainty. "You aren't leaving, ever." The word echoed in her head, and for a brief second Milano considered slapping him, screaming, doing something reckless just to break the control he held so effortlessly. But instinct took over instead, sharper and more urgent than pride, and she turned and ran. Her footsteps echoed through the hallways as she moved faster than she thought she could, her mind narrowing to one thought only: Leah. Get Leah and go? And when she reached the nursery door and grabbed the handle, her heart dropped as it didn't move. She pulled harder, panic rising as she realized it was locked, the mechanism smooth and unyielding beneath her hand. "No," she whispered, then louder. "No, no." Her fingers fumbling uselessly as she searched for something, anything to force it open. But the door didn't give. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and when she looked down, she saw the live feed from the nursery camera, clear and sharp, showing Leah asleep in the crib, safe and still, and a chair beside it. Brian sat there, relaxed, one arm resting casually as he leaned toward the sleeping baby, his voice low and intimate as it came through the speaker, each word landing like a calculated strike. "Don't worry, Leah," he murmured, his tone almost gentle, almost affectionate. "Mommy is just throwing a tantrum." He smiled softly at the child, a smile that never reached his eyes. "She'll learn to love the cage soon." Milano slid down the wall outside the locked door, her breath coming fast and shallow as the weight of his words settled over her. And in that moment she understood the true shape of what she had been brought into. Not a rescue, not a home, but a prison built from glass and gold, where escape wouldn't come from force, but from something far more dangerous. Milano did not fight him after that night, not because she accepted what he had done, but because she understood something essential the moment the nursery door locked behind her, and Brian's voice came through the monitor with that calm certainty. Open resistance was exactly what he expected, and exactly what he was prepared for. So she adjusted, Over the next 2 days, she learned the rhythms of the house the way a prisoner learns guard rotations, paying attention to when staff changed shifts, which cameras followed, which corridors, how often Brian checked in on Leah personally instead of relying on the monitors. She spoke when spoken to, nodded when Brian explained things she hadn't asked about, accepted the clothes laid out for her without comment, even thanked him once for the formula delivery, watching closely to see how his eyes softened at that, how his posture relaxed just a fraction. "That's better," he'd said, not unkindly, as if praising a lesson learned, and Milano forced herself to lower her gaze, to let him believe the fight had drained out of her, because survival now depended on patience, not pride. She spent her days near Leah, changing her, feeding her, humming quietly while keeping one eye on the cameras she could see and the ones she couldn't, memorizing the blind spots she suspected existed even if she couldn't confirm them yet, all the while listening, always listening, because men like Brian didn't stop talking when they thought they had already won. The opportunity came in a way that almost felt intentional, which made Milano suspicious, even as she took advantage of it. Brian announced he had a long meeting, something international, something that required his full attention, and he kissed Leah's forehead before leaving the nursery, telling Milano he'd be back later, his tone light, almost domestic, as if they were playing house instead of enacting a siege. Milano waited. She didn't move right away, didn't rush the moment the door closed behind him, because haste had been her enemy before. Instead, she went through the motions she'd rehearsed in her head, tidying the room, checking on Leah until she was asleep again, then walking slowly toward the library, her pulse steady but alert. The library was one of the few rooms without visible cameras, a design choice Brian had once explained as a preference for privacy, and as she stepped inside, she felt a flicker of grim satisfaction at the irony. Rows of books she knew he'd never read lined the walls, the smell of leather and polish heavy in the air, and in the corner, partially hidden behind a sliding panel, was the terminal she had noticed the night before, sleek and unassuming, like it didn't want to be, found. Her hands trembled slightly as she activated it, not from fear of being caught, but from the sense that whatever she was about to see would change things in ways she couldn't undo. The interface loaded quickly, too quickly, and when the folder list appeared, her eyes were immediately drawn to a name that made her stomach drop: Operation Milano. The title sat there without drama, clean and clinical, as if it belonged in a project management file rather than a record of someone's life being dismantled piece by piece. She stared at it for a long second before opening it, a quiet, disbelieving laugh slipping out as if her body needed some release before her mind could absorb what followed. Inside were subfolders, dozens of them, dated, labeled, organized, with the same precision Brian applied to his investments, and as Milano clicked through them, the pattern became impossible to deny. Every job application she had submitted over the past year was there, complete with her resume, cover letters she remembered agonizing over, interview notes she'd never seen, and rejection emails that now read like scripted performances. Notes in the margins explained decisions in cold, efficient language. Companies acquired quietly weeks before her application, hiring freezes enacted strategically, positions eliminated just in time to keep her from gaining stability. Her bank statements followed, charted month by month, annotated with comments about pressure points and sustainability thresholds. Her slow descent into poverty tracked the way someone might monitor a market trend. And the realization hit her so hard she had to grip the edge of the desk to stay upright. He hadn't found her by chance. He hadn't stumbled back into her life. He had been shaping it, narrowing her options, guiding her toward desperation with a patience that was far more frightening than any outburst. Her breathing grew shallow as she scrolled further, her mind racing back through memories that suddenly rearranged themselves into a new, horrifying logic. The interviews that felt promising before they abruptly vanished, the landlord who suddenly refused to renew her lease, the small freelance job that dried up without explanation, all of it lining up now with brutal clarity. "You did this," she whispered to the empty room, her voice barely audible because saying it out loud made it real in a way her thoughts hadn't yet allowed. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad as she reached the bottom of the folder, expecting nothing more than confirmation of what she already knew, and instead finding something that made her blood run cold. A live audio feed window blinked softly on the screen, active, streaming, and when she clicked it, the sound that filled the room was unmistakable. Her old apartment, the hum of the faulty light, the distant traffic. Her own voice, faint but clear, recorded from days ago, arguing quietly with herself about whether she could stretch the formula one more night. Milano stumbled back a step, bile rising in her throat as the truth snapped into place with terrifying precision, because this wasn't surveillance that had started after he found her. This had been ongoing. He had been listening for months, maybe longer, waiting, watching, calculating. He had known she was out of formula before she admitted it to herself. He had known the text was coming. The mistake hadn't been a mistake at all. It had been rerouted, intercepted, guided straight to him like everything else. Milano closed her eyes, her hands curling into fists as a single chilling thought settled over her with absolute certainty. Brian hadn't rescued her that night. He had hunted her. The quiet inside the library shifted in a way Milano had already learned to recognize, a subtle change in pressure that came before sound, before movement, before logic had time to warn her, and she knew he was there even before the faint click of the door registered behind her. She did not turn immediately because she understood now that reacting too fast was a weakness Brian cataloged and exploited. So she stayed where she was, her hands resting flat against the edge of the desk, the glow of the terminal still open behind her eyes. The words, Operation Milano, burned so deeply into her mind that she doubted they would ever fade. When she finally faced him, she made sure her expression was neutral, her breathing steady, her shoulders relaxed, because fear was a language Brian spoke fluently, and she refused to give him more material. He stood just inside the doorway, composed and immaculate, not a single sign of urgency or surprise on his face, as if he had expected to find her exactly where she was, as if this moment had already been accounted for in his plans. He closed the door gently, deliberately, the soft sound echoing louder in Milano's chest than it should have, sealing the room and cutting off any illusion of escape. And then he walked toward her with the same unhurried confidence she remembered from boardrooms and private negotiations, the confidence of a man who believed outcomes were decided long before conversations began. He did not ask what she had found. He did not accuse her of snooping or violating his trust. Instead, he reached into his jacket and placed a stack of documents on the desk between them with careful precision, aligning the edges as if disorder itself offended him, and laid a pen on top like a ceremonial offering. The gesture was calm, almost respectful, which made it far more dangerous than shouting ever could have been. "It's a marriage contract and a full custody waiver," he said, his voice even and controlled, stripped of emotion the way surgeons stripped instruments before an incision. Milano looked down at the papers without touching them, already feeling the weight of what they represented pressing into her chest. And when she didn't respond immediately, Brian continued, his tone steady, explanatory, as if he were guiding her through a reasonable decision rather than presenting an ultimatum designed to erase her autonomy. He explained the terms without flourish, the legal permanence of the arrangement, the benefits she and Leah would receive, the stability, the resources, the image of a complete family he would present to the world. And all the while, Milano listened without interrupting, because interrupting would have been an admission that she was still reacting instead of calculating. When he finally paused, he lifted his eyes to hers and delivered the threat with the same calm clarity. telling her that refusal would activate a different set of documents, photographs, reports carefully curated to depict her as negligent, unstable, incapable, a mother who loved her child but could not provide for her, and that the courts would not hesitate to remove Leah from that environment and place her under the guardianship of a man with limitless resources and an impeccable public image. "You won't see her again," he said simply, not as a warning but as a statement of fact. And in that moment Milano understood that this was the true shape of the cage, velvet-lined and polished, built not to restrain her body, but to suffocate every choice she had left. She picked up the papers slowly, her fingers brushing the heavy stock, her eyes scanning language designed to look mutual, while stripping her of leverage, line by line, and memories pressed in uninvited. Flashes of the man Brian used to be, or pretended to be, the one who spoke of partnership and protection, who framed control as devotion. And she felt a sharp, quiet grief for the version of herself who had once believed him. For a few dangerous seconds, anger surged hot and reckless, the urge to tear the papers in half, to scream, to throw the pen across the room and dare him to try. But beneath that anger was something steadier, colder, forged over the past year of scarcity and survival. She had already lost everything once. She would not lose her daughter now because of pride. She lowered herself into the chair across from him, deliberately slowing her movements, and picked up the pen with a hand that did not shake, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had finally stopped hoping fear would save her. Brian watched closely, mistaking her stillness for surrender, his posture loosening just slightly, his confidence settling deeper as he saw what he wanted to see, and Milano let him, because she had learned that the most dangerous thing she could do was confirm his assumptions. She signed her name carefully, not rushed, not hesitant, making sure every letter was clear and intentional, and with each stroke of the pen she felt the weight of the noose settle around her neck, soft and luxurious and deadly, tightening just enough to remind her it was there. When she finished, she set the pen down gently and pushed the documents back toward him, her face unreadable, her thoughts racing ahead faster than his ever could. Brian exhaled, a subtle release of satisfaction he didn't bother to hide, and stepped closer, reaching for the papers as if this moment sealed not just a contract, but ownership. He leaned in, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the familiarity that once would have made her relax, and tilted his head, already assuming the intimacy that came with victory. Milano turned her face away before his lips could touch her skin, the rejection small but deliberate, and when she spoke, her voice was low, steady, stripped of tremor or apology. She told him she had signed, confirmed what he already believed, and watched his mouth curve into a smile that never reached his eyes. Then she leaned forward just enough to ensure her next words landed exactly where she intended, not loud enough for anyone else to hear, not dramatic enough to sound like a threat, but sharp enough to cut through his certainty. She told him he had forgotten one thing, and when his expression shifted, curiosity, flickering across his features for the first time since he entered the room, Milano felt a quiet, dangerous satisfaction bloom beneath the fear. "I'm the only one who knows the truth about what happened a year ago," she whispered, letting the sentence hang unfinished between them, a promise rather than an explanation. And in the brief silence that followed, she saw it clearly. The smallest crack in the foundation of the cage he had built, and she knew with absolute certainty that while Brian believed he had finally secured her, the game had only just begun. The wedding had been planned with meticulous precision, every detail reflecting Brian's obsession with perfection, from the crystal chandeliers that hung above the room like suspended diamonds to the expensive silk drapes that whispered as the cold wind pressed against the glass walls of the mansion, each element meant to display control, wealth, and dominance. Milano walked into the hall with Leah cradled in her arms, her dress elegant but understated, her face calm and composed, concealing every trace of the storm that had been building within her for over a year. The guests were all carefully chosen, hand-picked investors and associates who had bought into the illusion of the perfect family, unaware of the tension simmering just beneath the surface. Brian moved ahead of her, exuding the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, his sharp suit tailored to emphasize strength and dominance, his smile practiced and sharp, designed to mask any hint of uncertainty. He carried himself as though the world was a chessboard and he had already won every game, unaware that the player he considered weak had already rewritten the rules while he had been planning his display of control. As the ceremony began, Milano felt the weight of each step, the soft swish of her dress echoing faintly in the marble halls, each movement measured, deliberate, a quiet promise that the final act would not follow the script Brian had written. She positioned Leah safely in her arms, her daughter oblivious to the silent war unfolding around her, and watched as Brian approached the podium for the toast, his eyes sweeping over the guests with a possessive gleam, the perfect husband, the perfect father in the eyes of those who didn't know the truth. He lifted his glass, voice confident and resonant, projecting charm and control, his every gesture calculated to maintain dominance. And Milano allowed the facade to continue, nodding at his words, murmuring the occasional cheers to maintain the pretense. Every moment he spent basking in the admiration of the crowd made her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with the thrill of anticipation, because she knew the exact moment when the illusion would shatter, when the house of cards he had built on obsession and control would collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. Brian raised his champagne glass higher, speaking of unity, loyalty, and family, his words designed to impress the assembled elite and reinforce the power he wielded over both wealth and people. Milano's fingers brushed the bodice of her dress, her hands resting on the pocket where she had concealed the DNA test, her heart steady despite the chaos she had endured to arrive at this moment. The room seemed to contract around them, a perfect cage of crystal and polished floors, the silent hum of controlled electricity through the chandeliers echoing the tension she felt. No one noticed the slight tightening of her grip on Leah. No one heard the subtle shift in her posture that signaled the final move of her strategy. And Brian remained oblivious, caught entirely in the grandeur of his own performance. Then, as he lifted his glass and prepared to deliver the concluding lines of his toast, Milano moved closer, stepping through the crowd with a quiet authority that no one challenged, her eyes fixed on him, watching his every micro-expression, cataloging his arrogance, knowing exactly how to fracture it. When Brian raised his glass to drink, Milano reached for the subtle trigger she had prepared, the sedative that mimicked a faint fizz of champagne at the surface, invisible to the eye and entirely undetectable to the untrained palate. "Don't worry," she whispered as she stepped close enough for her lips to brush his ear, her voice intimate, soft, a feigned tenderness designed to disarm him at the precise moment of attack. "It's not poison. It's a sedative." She let the words linger, watching as a flicker of confusion crossed his features for the briefest instant, his mind registering something amiss, even as his ego insisted it was impossible. While his attention had been absorbed in orchestrating appearances, while he had flaunted power and wealth to an audience eager to be dazzled, Milano had already enacted her plan, her hands having bypassed every safeguard he had installed, accessing the biometric override he had arrogantly reserved for the wife, draining his offshore accounts and simultaneously sending Operation Milano directly to the authorities, who had long suspected but never found concrete evidence of his manipulations. She had turned his tools of control into instruments of his downfall, weaponizing his obsession with security against him in a silent, devastating strike. Brian staggered slightly as the sedative took hold, his chest tightening involuntarily, his grip on the champagne glass faltering as his vision blurred. For a moment he tried to focus, trying to muster the confidence that had carried him through countless boardrooms and negotiations, trying to assert dominance even as the room began to tilt and his carefully constructed composure cracked. Milano stepped closer, her movement calm, unhurried, every inch of her body radiating controlled power, the image of serenity masking the fire of vengeance she had nurtured over the past year. She leaned just enough to whisper directly in his ear, letting the secret of her calculated revenge rest on her lips like a blade, and watched as his eyes widened slightly, recognition and disbelief mingling in a rare display of vulnerability. "While you were busy monitoring me," she murmured, her voice soft but sharp, "I used your own systems to bring everything down around you." His knees weakened, his hands reached instinctively to steady himself, and the champagne glass slipped unnoticed to the floor, shattering as Brian's world of perfection began to collapse in real time. The guests murmured in confusion, their attention snapping from applause to alarm as Brian clutched his chest, the sudden falter unplanned, unscripted, impossible to rationalize. Milano did not panic, did not cry out, because panic had never been her ally. She moved with purpose, lifting Leah protectively, her mind already calculating the next steps, the path from cage to freedom now paved by her own foresight. "And the best part?" she whispered again, leaning closer so that only he could hear, the last piece of her strategy laid bare. "Remember how you obsessed over the timeline? 1 year apart, a 7-month-old baby? You were so arrogant you assumed the math meant she was yours. But Brian, I was already seeing someone else the week I left you, someone who actually cared." She drew the DNA test from the hidden pocket in her dress and dropped it lightly onto his lap, the thin plastic and paper flashing under the chandelier light, and Brian's eyes widened further, disbelief mingling with a faint, helpless realization that the very foundation of his obsession, the assumption that he controlled paternity, loyalty, and love, was now exposed as false. Sirens erupted in the distance, low at first, then insistent, blue and red flashing across the windows as the FBI surrounded the mansion, the culmination of the months of meticulous planning that Milano had quietly executed while pretending to submit. Security guards, once unquestioning in their allegiance, faltered, hesitated, uncertain whether to obey the orders of a man whose wealth had been neutralized in an instant, whose empire now crumbled like sand, slipping through tightly clasped hands. Milano picked up Leah, holding her daughter close, the baby yawning and unaware of the chaos that surrounded them, and walked past the immobilized guards with a calm authority that contrasted sharply with the confusion of those who had sworn loyalty to Brian's power. Each step was deliberate, a quiet statement of victory, a reclaiming of agency that had been denied for far too long. And as they exited the glass mansion that had been a gilded prison, Milano did not glance back, because the destruction she had engineered would speak louder than any look, any gesture, any words she could spare. Brian slumped into his chair, the last remnants of control slipping away as the sirens closed in, as the authorities accessed every file, as his carefully constructed empire of obsession and manipulation crumbled beneath the weight of his own arrogance, and Milano, holding Leah close, finally felt the freedom she had fought for a year. She had outplayed the architect of her misery, dismantled the velvet noose he had placed around her life, and in the silence that followed, broken only by the distant hum of sirens and the faint, steady heartbeat of her daughter in her arms, Milano understood the full power of calculated patience, intelligence, and resolve. She had not just survived, she had rewritten the rules, she had reclaimed her life, and she had burned the man who had tried to cage them both. The mansion behind her was no longer a palace, no longer a fortress. It was a monument to a lesson Brian would never forget, and Milano stepped into the night with Leah, not as a victim, not as prey, but as a queen of her own fate, finally free.